Good morning, everybody. We're here today to present our group project about the process behind making our podcast, Plastic Surgery, a Savior or a Nightmare.
So we first started off by reflecting on our Artifact 2 project. So Lindsay did her video on female stereotypes in cartoons, and Neon did her project on LGBTQ issues in China, and I did how the lack of diversity in mannequins impact our beauty standards. So we brainstormed those topics, and we found some are still interest us, so we narrowed down to like beauty standards, body use for science, ethical concerns, abortion, and plastic surgery. Then we came up with some criteria in choosing the topic. So we first wanted the topic to be controversial, so we can have like a very thorough conversation about it. So we want the topic to enable us to deliver a meaningful conversation. So we decided our topic to be plastic surgery. So this is just our project timeline. So one thing I want to highlight about this is we spent the entire week after our first meeting just purely doing research on this topic. So that we have like enough like arguments and points to talk about.
So the genre or format we decided on was kind of like an educational panel podcast that would offer various perspectives on concurrent medical issues. We called it BuzzMed because it was going to be aimed towards Georgia Tech students, so they could just hear kind of like the latest things going on. So we had a host, which was Yuyan, and then she would invite two special guests to present different arguments and counter each other. So we kind of wanted a laid-back tone a little bit. It wasn't like a high-end strung argument with a lot of like fighting. It was very civil, so we each would take turns talking and presenting arguments and counter-arguments. So we kind of chose this format because, as Joanna was talking about, plastic surgery is a pretty controversial issue. So we wanted to provide two different perspectives on the various subtopics related to it and it itself. It also made it a lot easier when we were recording because we could just record our lines separately since we already knew what the arguments and counters were going to be, and then we could slice the audio together. So it's easier for each of us to just record, and it's easier for each of us to edit our own audio and then put it all together. But at the end, near our conclusion, we became a lot more free-flowing with the discussion, and it wasn't as just like I was talking, Joanna was talking. It was the two of us together. So it was no longer debate, because we just wanted to come to a bigger conclusion, so it was more free-flowing. But there was kind of some issues with it too, because we would kind of make each other laugh a little bit. So here's kind of like an example.
It's been a nice seeing you on this podcast, Dr. Brown.
Same, Becky.
Thank you for having us on here.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Turner. Miss Turner, thank you so much for having us on here. I hope that...
So we would just kind of make ourselves laugh, and we were just doing it kind of all together. And that's an unedited clip, so there's still some sound things we need to fix as well.
So we decided our audience to be the public, mainly for GT community, and especially for young adults aged from 18 to 25. So we chose this audience because we feel like during this age period, beauty standards values are still in the formation, and it's very important to have such discussion if it's in the young population, and to build this kind of healthy, supportive, discussion-based platform to allow different voices to be expressed and heard. So we, over the course of our research, we found two very interesting points that were not very widely discussed. So the first one is the psychological effect. So a lot of people are not aware of mental illness associated with plastic surgeries. So we specifically talked about BDD population in our podcast. So they're not very well identified, and therefore, if BDD patients have plastic surgery, it might have like very serious aftermath. And another interesting point I find out is the influence on teenagers, because the young population is actually becoming the backbone of plastic surgery nowadays. So we think it's very concerning, and it's very worthy to be discussed about. So after talking about 2 points, we connected to the bigger picture. So we tailored our podcast in a way that the progression of the discussion is kind of like our logical progression. So it started off by talking about individual. So we talked about individual satisfaction after plastic surgery. Then we kind of talked about psychological impact, and that leads us to talk about a bigger population in society, which are teenagers. So as we're trying to analyze this trend, we're starting to talk about the root of this problem, this trend is, so that connects us to the bigger image about normative beauty standards in society. So that's kind of like our progression of discussion and also the logical progression behind it.
So here's kind of a sample of our script. So as you can see, the way we constructed it, it was the argument and then the counter that we came up with it, and we had who was going to say it. So this made it a lot easier to record because then we basically knew what the person was going to say, so you didn't have to be in the same room because you already knew like the outline of what they're going to say. We didn't read it exactly from it, but we just had like the main ideas. So how did we come to like the larger significance of beauty standards with the podcast? So we wanted each listener to be able to take something away from the podcast and have a deeper significance, even if you don't get plastic surgery or you don't even really care about it. Because beauty standards are kind of a universal thing and you can't avoid it. Even if like you think it doesn't affect you in society, they're always there in the media and social media especially. And then additionally, the beauty standards notion kind of originated, as Joanna was talking about, from both her top artifact 2 and my artifact 2. So like my artifact 2 talked about like unattainable like, female stereotypes in cartoons and how like that can lead to a lot of negative mental problems, which kind of goes along the line of like Photoshop and plastic surgery. You can't get what you actually see with beauty standards. And Joanna's was talking about like a bunch of underrepresented groups and how like the beauty standards can affect them. So, and we also just agreed that plastic surgery wasn't the root of a lot of issues that came with it, but it was more of like beauty standards. So we kind of wanted to point this out and leave the viewer with something they might have not thought about with plastic surgery before.
So what effects are we planning to do? As we are still in the middle of editing, so we haven't actually put those effects into our real podcast. And the first one we're going to put in is the Georgia Tech whistle. And as it is a tradition of Georgia Tech, and we also have this whistle after our English class, I just want to put it into our podcast to like make our Georgia Tech students, like our main audience, be more engaged and excited. And the second point is the news opening theme. As the setting of our podcast is similar like the news television station, so we're going to use it to make our like playing the roles more naturally. And number 3 is other undecided sound effects because we haven't like actually putting those into our podcast. Yeah, and what have you found difficult to accomplish? The first one and the most obvious one is the first time for like all 3 of us to make a podcast. So we have to follow the format and structure we just learned, and how to distribute the time used on like the points, evidence, stake, and roles. And the second one is to balance the points, because like at the beginning of our podcast, like at the beginning of the planning, we actually like found like it's easier for the pro sides to get their arguments. So it's based on our evidence found online. So it's very hard to make those 2 pros and cons to get balanced arguments. We just smartly decided to use some counter arguments to fix this problem. And the third point is to come to a strong one-side conclusion. As you all know that actually plastic surgery is very controversial, so it is very hard for us to reach a conclusion and to persuade either pros or cons side. So we just leveled it into another deeper discussion of beauty standard instead of like saying plastic surgery is good or not. Yeah. And did we experience any technical difficulties, and which difficulties are unique for these artifacts than the other ones? The most obvious one is Audacity and Snowball mic. Because in our artifact 1 and 2, actually in artifact 2 we also use the sounds. We need the sounds to make our video, but unlike artifact 2, in artifact 3 we only can use audio and electronics, which means that we have to use sound source with better quality. So in this issue, we have to use the freaking Snowball and Audacity, and we actually spend a lot of time on Snowball and Audacity because we just cannot connect it the Snowball into Audacity as an input, and it just seldomly just put the laptop built-in microphone as the input. So just at some moment, it just fixed itself randomly. It's a random error, and we didn't like we haven't get to know like why you refuse to work till this moment. And the second point is the teamwork. Unlike Artifact 1 and 2, which are all individual work, Artifact 3 is a teamwork project, so it's very hard for us to find the time to work together. for all three of us, so it also translates into food.
So if we could restart this project, would we do anything differently? So before our first recording session, I would have maybe messed around with Audacity and the Snowball mic first, because when we got there, it was kind of the first time we ever tried to use it, and basically we didn't get anything recorded because I just couldn't figure out how to hook it up right, and my laptop was just not having fun with me today. So when I just spent like an hour afterwards just kind of messing with it, and I figured out how to work a lot of it, which helped a lot. We were able to record really quickly the second time. So I would have gone back and done that prior to when we started. And I had some issues with sending them their audio clips so they could begin to edit individually, because I recorded all of it on different tracks for the same file. But in order to send it as an MP3, I would have to only send one track at a time. And additionally, I couldn't even send the tracks because I didn't have the lame encoder, which, I mean, if I knew more about Audacity, I might have been able to realize that before I kind of just sat there for 10 minutes frustrated, but I didn't. So I would have learned more about Audacity before beginning that part. And then maybe we kind of underestimated how long it would take to do recording and writing the script and finalizing it. So in our outline for the timeline, we would have been a little bit more detailed with how long we were going to spend on everything and maybe buffered in more time. And additionally, going back, we could have like focused our topic even further on plastic surgery in a country outside the US, because I know it's very big in Brazil and South Korea, so it would have been kind of interesting to view if there's like any cultural differences between the two countries that kind of make them different from the United States with plastic surgery.
Q&A. Do you have any questions?
Where did you look for the research that you have used to create your argument?
I looked a little bit from Georgia Tech's online library,
Mm-hmm.
and when we couldn't find too much, we looked at like science databases and like mental health databases. So like our article about body dysmorphic disorders from like it's from
journal
Yes.
journal article, because we want the arguments to be like supported by stats too, and so we spend a lot of time in like the database trying to find like articles and support.
And we tried to be really careful with which ones we use, because some of like the original results we got were just kind of like blogs talking about plastic surgery.
Yeah.
And besides from the poor grammar they had on there, you could kind of tell it was very biased, so you just had to be very careful with that, so we tried not to use any of those.
We also did some Google research, but like the thing we did is like if we found something, we'll like go back and like try to like find the actual journal article that mentions it, like blog or whatever. So we're trying to.
Do you think your argument is reflective of your personal opinions?
I don't think my side of the argument is entirely reflected, because I played Becky Adams, a plastic surgeon from California. So I was kind of pro for plastic surgery, which I'm not necessarily for. Well, my real opinion is I don't really care what you kind of do with your life, kind of, and I don't think it's, I think we all kind of agreed at the end that beauty standards is more of the problem than plastic surgery. So we all kind of agreed with that by the end, but in the first part of the argument, I don't know, did you agree with your part?
Cause I was kind of like the counter part. I was playing this like doctor-ish character. So at the beginning, I was kind of like have this kind of bias towards plastic surgery. But like as more I found out about like special cases where like like we've read about like this case about like this girl is like being bullied by like the entire school because like she doesn't like look like she has like some like looks issues and stuff like that. So like we started to like kind of like transit our like focus on from like plastic surgery to like a bigger image. So that's how we kind of like trying to be unbiased and just like simply present our points.
Anybody else? All right. Thank you very much, ladies.